April 1999, and a survey vessel is approaching the Galassa Straits in the South China Sea between Sumatra and Borneo. It's called the Restless M, and it's under the command of one of the most successful treasure hunters of all time, Australian Michael Hatcher. Hatcher became famous for discovering the Nanking cargo on a Dutch East Indiaman on a reef in northern Indonesia. The 150,000 pieces of Chinese porcelain he recovered fetched £12 million at auction in 1986. But that was 13 years ago. Since then, Mike Hatcher has seen lean times, a series of setbacks and disappointments. Now back on his lucky boat, the Restless M, he's hoping the treacherous waters around the Belvedere Reef will bring a change in his fortunes.
Well, here's Belvedere Reef. I'd go round anchor in the shallow over there, huh? I wouldn't want to go in there any closer. This was like the expressway from China heading to Batavia. Gasper Island was the mark, and this is just one of the reefs that are actually on this thoroughfare going through here. And she's claimed more wrecks than any other rock in the South China Sea.
He's been led to this reef by a hunch, based on an obscure reference in a maritime archive. It was found by the other half of this extraordinary wreck-detecting duo, British marine historian Nigel Pickford, in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich.
Both Mike and I had been interested in the Galassa Straits for some time. It was a notorious accident black spot area for shipping. I had a list of some 50 or more wrecks around the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th centuries, all in this one small area. But the one that excited us most appears here in James Horsborough's Directions for Sailing to the East Indies. He says, "Was wrecked on these shoals also a large Chinese junk, part of whose crew reached Gasper Island, and others, who were found floating on fragments of the wreck, were saved by the laudable exertions of a country ship belonging to Calcutta." A large junk at that time may well have been laden with a rich cargo of gold and porcelain. But that was all we knew. We had no date for the sinking, no name for the ship. For the cargo to have any real value, it would be necessary for me to discover the story behind Horsborough's brief passing comment. Problem was, where to start.
This is the scene of Michael Hatcher and Nigel Pickford's detective story, a part of the Java Sea between the islands of Sumatra and Borneo, called the Galassa Straits. James Horsborough's own map of the Galassa Straits, then known as the Gaspar Straits, dated 1819, clearly shows that the Belvedere Reef was known to Western mariners by the early 19th century. In fact, for this very reason, most shipping, Western and Chinese, preferred the alternative route through the Straits of Bangkok. For Horsborough's account of the junk sinking to be correct, however, the captain of the junk, perhaps to save some time on his journey, must have chosen the shortcut through the Galassa Straits on his way to Batavia, the headquarters of the powerful Dutch East India Company on the island of Java. Michael Hatcher and his crew aboard the Restless M began the arduous task of trying to locate the wreck of the junk.
Okay, slow down 3 knots.
Hatcher reckoned that as the junk had probably hit the reef from the north, it would have sunk eventually in the deeper water to the south of the reef. He decided to concentrate on an area of 155 square kilometres between the Belvedere Reef and Gaspar Island. The Restless M is bristling with modern wreck-finding technology. One key piece of equipment is the magnetometer.
Okay, steady 3.2.
Towed behind the Restless M, it would pick up any small perturbation in the magnetic field caused by metal on the seabed. The problem is, the wrecks of modern steel ships will produce a signal that would swamp any signal from a wooden vessel, like the junk thereafter. They have to fine-tune the magnetometer to pick out these weak signals. The magnetometer works in tandem with a side-scan sonar. This is trawled behind the Restless M, much closer to the seabed. It sends out sound waves laterally, which strike the seabed and bounce back to its transponder. Any structure on the seabed, an outcrop of rocks or a wreck mound, will show up as an anomaly on the paper readout.
We've got Red One steering. He's trying to maintain the line on this monitor here, and so he tries to steer the ship using the autopilot here, maintaining a watch on the depth sounder here, and at the same time trying to steer as close a course as he can.
The Restless M skipper knew where he was to an accuracy of a few meters, thanks to his global positioning system. This allowed him to steer up and down the search sector in a succession of parallel lines, only meters apart, continuously taking data as he went.
34, yeah. Speed okay? 3. She's down to 3 anyway. Okay, on location, I'll ease back to survey speed.
Not for nothing is this called mowing the lawn. Working from dawn to dusk, 7 days a week, the Restless M combed the Glacis Straits for over a month. Not an inch of the seabed was left uncharted. It's difficult work. The magnetometer and side-scan sonar give ambiguous results that are impossible to interpret fully without a dive to corroborate them. Hundreds of dives turned up nothing but lumps of rock, rusting trawlers and discarded anchors. They were within a few days of giving up the survey operation, and they decided to do one final dive on yet another humdrum sonar picture backed up with a faint signal on the magnetometer. When divers went down to examine that sonar anomaly, they came back claiming they had seen what appeared to be a wreck site. Michael Hatcher immediately decided to check it out for himself. As he descended slowly into the gloom towards the seabed 100 feet below, he scarcely dared hope that at this 11th hour they'd located a wreck. The first thing he saw was an extraordinary line of dark rings, almost buried in the sand, perfectly in line, stretching away into the gloom. As he followed them, he came across what he has since described as the most astounding sight of his career. A wreck mound that rose some 2 meters above the seabed and extended further than he could see. Though thickly encrusted with coral, the mound was clearly covered with Chinese porcelain. Although Michael Hatcher is a highly experienced wreck hunter, he could hardly believe the sheer scale of the discovery. In a series of dives, Hatcher rapidly gathered enough samples for a proper analysis of the porcelain before the Restless M could head back to Singapore. Then he contacted Nigel Pickford in London to see if he could find out whether the mysterious line of iron rings he'd found could possibly have come from a junk.
This is the Bible on Chinese junks, written by Captain Audemard in 1957, and it is quite explicit about those iron rings. Here it says, "The masts are fished together and strengthened by a series of iron collars." The iron rings Mike had found must have originally been placed at regular intervals up one of the junk's masts. They now lie in a perfectly straight line on the seabed, the wood of the mast having long ago rotted away.
It now looked as if they had indeed found a junk, but could it be Horsburgh's junk? Michael Hatcher headed back to Singapore to set up a full-scale salvage operation. It took him 2 months to pull the package together. In the meantime, Gasper Island clung on to its secrets. In August, a huge salvage barge, the Swissco Marine 2, arrived in the Galassa Straits. It was anchored at all 4 corners directly over the wreck. The barge is a floating industrial complex, 60 metres long by 15 metres wide. It's equipped with a 50-ton crane, decompression chambers, and a 3-storey accommodation block sufficient for a crew of 50. In 2 months, Mike Hatcher had put together a recovery team built around a core of men who've worked with him on countless wrecks over the past 25 years. Some of them, like Abdul Rahim here, had been with him on the Gelder Meissen. The divers worked in pairs. Lower to the seabed in a cage, with air fed to them by airline from an onboard pump. This gave each diving team 90 minutes on the bottom, enough to do a careful inspection of the wreck site and to begin loading the porcelain carefully by hand. As they began the huge task of recovering the cargo of porcelain and other artifacts, no one knew what they would find. At this stage, they still had no clear idea of the nature of the wreck.
Right now we're working on the stern and we try to expose the whole hull. By then we should be able to tell whether this is one wreck or 2 wrecks collided to one another, or maybe even one wreck that broken into 2.
As the first crates of cargo came to the surface, the entire crew of the barge was deeply involved in the process of discovery. It was obvious that there was a colossal cargo of porcelain to be raised, but what else would be found to help unravel the mystery of this shipwreck? Where had it come from? Who was on board? How had it foundered? The early layers of porcelain from the top of the wreck mound have clearly been exposed to the tropical seas for almost 200 years. They were covered in coral growths. But in addition to the porcelain, a steady stream of more utilitarian items came on board.
What does it mean?
Like these personal name stamps. It was hoped that all these would give some indication of the origin of the wreck. But instead they painted a confusing picture.
We don't know exactly what the wreck is yet, whether it's Chinese or European, but there's a lot of porcelain on board. We found a Spanish coin. It has a date 1797. Some European coins and Chinese coins, so there's still confusion.
The wreck was a genuine time capsule, slowly revealing more secrets, and no one knew what might be revealed next. These wine bottles suggest they'd found a European vessel. But this box was definitely of Chinese origin.
Well, it looks like a box of black hair pieces, little rolls of hair, and there seems to be quite a few of them stacked on top of each other.
This is on the highest part of the wreck, and it now looking that we've got something like 15 to 18 feet of porcelain on the front section. And these plates here are exactly the same pattern as we got off the Gildemeister. Exactly the same.
The Gildemeister was the name of the Dutch East Indiaman from which Mike Hatcher retrieved the famous Nanking cargo. But that ship sank in 1752, much earlier than the reference to the junk in Horsburgh's book. Had they got the wrong ship?
This plate here is definitely for the Cape of Good Hope, whereas that is Europe. So that was the difference. And then if we look at some of the other stuff, we're seeing local stuff. So she's got such a variety. I don't think any vessel sunk has got the variety that this boat's got.
For all his experience, Hatcher was still uncertain as to the identity of this wreck and its intended destination.
I don't think we're there. I think we're still stuck between, is she a home boat, as in that she was a boat built for the Europeans to sail between the local ports, or is she a Chinese vessel? I'm leaning more towards a home boat, that she had a lot of Europeans on board, but she's one of the big ones.
Chinese porcelain can be more valuable than gold bullion, only if it's in good condition, its age and place of manufacture is of interest, and the history that lies behind its sinking is known in detail. The pressure on Nigel Pickford to supply the answers to these questions was growing all the time.
I desperately needed to pinpoint the date the junk sank. That was the first step to learning more about it. The 5th edition of Horsburgh of 1843 had mentioned the sinking, but the 1st edition of 1809 did not refer to it. Neither did the very rare 2nd edition of 1817, which I finally tracked down here in the Caird Library of the National Maritime Museum. The 3rd edition of 1827, however, did mention it, so it seemed reasonable to presume that the junk had sank some time between 1817 and 1827. I had narrowed the gap, but I still had a decade of maritime history to wade through. I calculated that my best chance of finding further information was if the laudable English captain mentioned by Horsburgh had filed a report on his return to Calcutta. So I began the laborious task of reading through the almost indecipherable issues of the Calcutta Journal in the British newspaper library at Colindale. I soon realised that it might take me many months to get through the whole decade. Also, some of the editions were missing entirely. I began to despair of ever finding a lead to the shipwreck.
The Galassa Straits were proving reluctant to fully yield their secrets. Gaspar Island stands sentinel to this reef-strewn sea and has changed very little since Horsburgh's day. Thickly wooded, lacking fresh water and totally uninhabited. A temporary refuge for itinerant fleets of fishermen. And a place for Michael Hatcher to ruminate on whether or not he stood on the threshold of the greatest find of his career or another expensive disappointment.
It was then that I remembered that as well as mentioning the iron rings, Audemard had also referred to a large Chinese junk that sank in the port of Amoy, which is some 3,000 kilometres away from the Glasser Straits. But he also said that there had been an English captain called Pearl who had rescued some of the survivors. And he said the date of sinking was 1822. The reference to an English captain and the date of sinking were both broadly consistent with the Horsburgh information. Perhaps Audemard had got the place of sinking wrong, but the date of sinking right. I decided to go straight to the year 1822 and take a chance. I went back to Conindale, with the whole investigation hanging by this very tenuous thread.
Back in Southeast Asia, that uncertainty was also unsettling Michael Hatcher. No one knows the South Java Sea better than Hatcher. He's been salvaging wrecks in these waters for over 25 years. But this salvage operation was costing over $20,000 a day. He desperately needed the reassurance from Nigel Pickford that he was spending it to salvage a wreck of genuine significance. Meanwhile, back in London, Nigel Pickford's hunch about 1822 was about to pay off.
It turned out to be the most astonishing stroke of luck. The Journal for the 31st of May 1822 carried a major story on the sinking of a large Chinese junk on the Belvedere Reefs while en route from Amoy to Java. Audemard had indeed got the place of sinking completely wrong, but at least he got the date right. And there was the stark information on the appalling scale of the disaster and the massive loss of life.
Nigel Pickford was nearing the end of his detective trail, but he still lacked the name of the junk and final corroboration of the Calcutta Journal's melancholy account. Completing his investigation took him to the Netherlands, to the Museum and Library of the Dutch East India Company, situated in The Hague. Batavia had been the hub of Dutch colonial presence in Southeast Asia, and in their trading annals, they meticulously recorded a wealth of mercantile detail. Pickford discovered that the junk had been named the Tek Sing, or True Star, that it had indeed been bound for Batavia from Amoy when it came to grief on Belvedere Rock. Poised over the Belvedere Reef, Mike Hatcher was now in his element. He's always been a hands-on treasure hunter, diving with his recovery teams, leading from the front. Now, after years of frustration and disappointment, his salvage barge was anchored over the largest junk ever located, lifting the largest cargo of porcelain ever recovered.
Brand new pattern for you.
The salvage technique he had adopted was working smoothly. Teams of divers working back-to-back throughout the daylight hours, from dawn to dusk. Wearing state-of-the-art equipment, helmets with built-in lights and a voice and video link to the surface control room, the divers were carefully working their way along the huge length of the wreck mound. They used suction hoses to remove the layers of sand and silt that had buried the Tek Sing's hull and cargo. Slowly revealing for the first time in 180 years the timber packing cases and the porcelain, just as it had been stacked by the Chinese merchants when the junk set sail from Amoy. It was remarkably undamaged. In the control room on the barge, the dive masters could track what was happening on the seabed and direct the search teams. This was important both for diver safety and to ensure they took archaeological care. The Tek Sing is undoubtedly one of the most important finds in the whole record of Chinese maritime trade. Its size, the nature of its cargo, and the scale of the tragedy give it a unique place in history. Mike Hatcher's hunch to work the southern flank of the Belvedere Reef had paid rich dividends. Meanwhile, on the recovery barge, hour after hour, day after day, the lifting cage brought the Texing's rich cargo to the surface. The routine was now well established. As August faded into September, the porcelain and other artifacts came to the surface in a steady stream, to be cleaned and logged by the surface teams. By now the divers were deep into the cargo, and the porcelain was pristine, unmarked. And it was becoming clear that although there were some similarities with the porcelain from the Geldermeissen, much of the Texing's cargo was new to Western eyes. Diving at 100 feet for 90 minutes called for a slow decompression period. So as soon as they came to the surface, the race was on to get the divers out of their diving gear and into the decompression chambers.
The depth we're working now is about 100 foot. The divers have to do decompression in the diving chamber to cut the decompression time. The reason we have to get the divers in the chamber because we have to release nitrogen by breathing oxygen.
Inside the decompression chamber, the divers breathe oxygen. The decompression process prevents nitrogen bubbling out of their bloodstream and causing damage. During the hour they spend inside the chamber, the pressure is slowly brought down from the equivalent of 100 feet underwater to surface pressure. Meanwhile, the next pair of divers were already taking their place in the diving cage. This is what back-to-back diving means. On the seabed, as more and more of the silt was sucked away, it became possible to identify the shattered timbers of the hull and accurately measure its dimensions. The junk was over 9 meters wide and over 50 meters in length, almost as big as the salvage barge that now floats above it, a trading ship to stand comparison with,
for instance, large junks designed very much like this one here, but of 2,000, 3,000 tons burden, used to sail from China round to India and as far as Africa. And at that period, China dominated the oceans of the world. And in 1822, when the Texing set sail, it was also a very large junk for the time, over 1,000 tons. Chinese shipbuilders were the first to use transverse bulkheads to divide the lower cargo hull here into separate watertight compartments, probably 15 or more of them between the prow and the stern. And they did this hundreds of years before the idea was ever thought of by Western shipbuilders. A junk like the Texing was also divided longitudinally, so the whole of the cargo hull down here was in fact 100 or more separate compartments, and each merchant would have had his own compartment for the storage of his own goods. When the Texing set sail from Amoy in 1822, the 200 or so merchants that were on board would have all been living in a series of tiny thatched huts built up at the stern, a sort of multi-storey effect. But the 1,600 or so emigrants that were also on board would have been living exposed to the elements on deck, and they would have only had a tiny amount of space, just the size of a small rattan mat. That the whole ship was so heavily laden, both with cargo and people, that if anything untoward was going to happen, it was a recipe for a catastrophic loss of life.
By 1822, however, China's period of maritime dominance was coming to an end, and the country was facing economic ruin. The problem was caused in large part by the British, who were carrying ever-increasing quantities of Indian-grown opium into China and fueling a national addiction.
To the British in the early 19th century, trading in opium was no more illegal than trading in tea. And although the Chinese authorities continually tried to stamp it out, the quantity of opium imported into China jumped from 200 chests in the year 1729 to over 10,000 chests by 1820. And it all had to be paid for in Chinese silver.
At the beginning of January 1822, an opium clipper, the Indiana, under the command of Captain James Pearl, was about to leave Calcutta with a full cargo of opium. It was bound for the Chinese merchants waiting in the entrepot ports of Borneo. Its route was to take it around the coast of Sumatra, then up the Java Sea, heading for Borneo via the Galassa Straits. On the 14th of January, the Texing set sail from Amoy. The 1,600 emigrants on board, driven from China by economic hardship, were looking forward to a new life in the plantations of Java. They travelled uneventfully for over 2 weeks. First hugging the coast of Indochina, before making the crossing to the Malay Peninsula near Singapore. They then turned south into their final leg, towards the Galassa Straits and their destination port of Batavia. On the night of the 6th of February, they were being blown along by a fierce northeast monsoon.
Dawn broke on Thursday the 7th of February 1822. Captain Pearl and his crew were confronted by the most extraordinary sight. They were doggedly tacking into the northeast monsoon just to the south of Gasper Island, when it seemed they had strayed into an area where the surface of the sea was punctured by hundreds of small rocks. Gradually they realised they weren't rocks at all, but shipwrecked Chinese desperately clinging for survival to makeshift rafts of rattans or bundles of parasols. Captain Pearl immediately ordered the ship's boats to be lowered and set about pulling as many as he could from the water. They toiled all that day, and by the end of it, they had saved 95 people from the waves.
The next day, Captain Pearl turned his attention to Gaspar Island, where he could dimly make out, through the lowering cloud and sea spray, huddled groups of soaking, terrified and injured survivors crowding the beaches. At great risk to himself and his crew, Captain Pearl daringly and repeatedly rowed into the shore and picked up every living soul he could find.
Finally, on the Friday afternoon, they left the scene of the disaster and set sail for the coast of Borneo. They had 190 survivors on board. The rest of the 1,600 passengers, plus 100 or more of crew, had perished, together with the Texing itself.
The wreck of the Texing provides one last ironic twist to this tragic tale. It dashed Captain Pearl's hopes of making a fortune. The 2 days he spent picking up survivors destroyed his plans to sell his opium cargo into a Dutch East Indies port. His altruism ruined him. The Texing's hull has safeguarded the cargo that was bound for Java all those years ago. Inside these massive timbers, an 18-foot depth of porcelain remains, scarcely damaged. Only the Texing's cannon lie scattered on the seabed. During the entire salvage operation, Mike Hatcher and his crew only managed to find 7 cannon on the wreck. This puzzled them until they learned that the paranoid Chinese authorities of the day, fearing insurrection, limited all Chinese merchantmen to 1 single cannon. The junk's captain had clearly smuggled a few more on board, but the Texing was woefully armed compared with a European vessel of the same size in those pirate-infested waters. Another day's diving operation draws to an end in late September. It's now 3 months since they first dropped anchor off Belvedere Reef. 3 months of relentless diving, recovery and cleaning. As they relax after another back-breaking 16-hour day, few of them can have realised just how capacious the Texing's holds would prove to be. By mid-October, the salvage of the Texing's cargo was slowly coming to an end. They stacked up nearly 300,000 pieces of porcelain, and there was still more to come. All of it between 200 and 300 years old, and much of it unique because so little of its style has ever been seen before in the West. At this stage, the barge resembles a production line in a porcelain factory. All of it has to be cleaned, stacked, catalogued and packed, ready for transshipment to Singapore and then on to Europe. Although most of this porcelain will end up in Western collectors' hands, it may not be too fanciful to imagine that thanks to the global nature of today's auctions, some of it could well end up where it was originally intended, in Jakarta, built on the site of the old Batavia.
It's a remarkable cargo, primarily because it's enormous. The largest cargo, I believe, that's been brought up to date of Chinese ceramics. The principal cargo appears to have come from the Dehua region right down in the south. The pieces encompass, interestingly, a very large variety of objects, and in that sense the cargo is a great find because we can see almost probably the whole gamut of things that were being exported at the time, and probably also a lot of these types are known on the archaeological sites of Java and Sumatra and other islands round about. But very little has come over to Europe, and even the great museums like the Victoria and Albert Museum and the British Museum have precious little of it. One of the pieces which probably is amongst the best examples on the ship, this piece has all the brushstrokes of a painter, really, who might have been painting on a scroll. You can see a very artistic hand at work with these flourishing brushstrokes producing the reeds and grasses. And equally, if you turn the piece on its side, you see the fineness. The potter has decided to turn over a very good example of block printing, and they just, as it were, put it on with great speed. You can see they didn't bother that there was a join. Here, for example, we have an area where they clearly didn't press the thing down hard enough. In other areas, you have a leakage of ink going from one design to the other. So they were made in large numbers and were clearly an important part of the cargo because there were large numbers on the boat itself. These are a favourite of mine. The whole bowl represents a flower head, probably a lotus flower. Each petal within the two lines of petals contains alternating designs of fungus and peach, both of which in Chinese representation are symbols of long life. And this goes right round the inside and the outside. This is a very traditional way of producing a dish or a bowl. The centre of the flower is beautifully rendered as a spiral, done with great skill, and each bowl that I handled in the cargo, where there were thousands, had a similarly well-produced spiral. Well, these teapots come from a different part of China, not too far away, called Yixing. This piece, as you can see, is simple, of elegant form, taking a small amount of tea because tea was very expensive and they didn't want to waste it. And underneath we have an example of calligraphy of must have been the 1820s, which would be in the form of a poem. People would get makers to produce pots just so that they could put their own calligraphy on it. Not all the pieces on the Texing were utilitarian. A small number of items, such as these birds, were clearly made with a decorative purpose. They are extremely rare. I have personally never seen anything quite like these before, and I'm not even sure where they were made. The suggestion of the browns and the blacks is that they probably come from the same area as the teapots. You can see beautiful hairwork, not only painted in detail, but also nicely incised. A lot of work involved, which implies that they were not cheap objects. Well, these little boys here, of which there are 3 out of perhaps 150 on the boat, are an enigma and especially interesting. First of all, one should look at them purely from the point of view of their charm. Here we have biscuit models with only a tiny bit of glaze, and what is particularly unusual is you can see the little straps that must have been painted on in a red pigment, and the lips must also have been painted red. You can just see traces of it. You can see that the hands are very pretty. We've got the black hair as well, a lovely smile, beautiful detail. These pieces present an enigma because There is no doubt that these predate practically everything else on the cargo. We see little of this class of wares, even in our museums. It's a great opportunity for scholars to look at a